or three things rather, that are top of the agenda here. That's Brexit, President-elect Trump, or President Trump in a few days from now, and his foreign policy approach, and the imminent elections across the European continent. Let's start with Brexit. We had Prime Minister Theresa May lay out a roadmap yesterday. What did you make of it?
Well, I think on Tuesday, Theresa May made a very important speech on her path to Brexit, which was, in her words, intended to be a clean Brexit. What her strategic aim is to have a UK-EU strategic partnership on the economic, financial, diplomatic and security level. And in a way, her speech stepped back from the detail of the intricacies of single market, customs union and the like, to say our goal at the end of 2 years must be to have a grown-up UK-EU strategic partnership. What I think was clear is that she also said that it was important to have some sort of transitional agreement or an implementation phase, because it was important to give some degree of certainty to business and time for business to plan for the outcome. So it was a very positive speech, and of course she emphasized global Britain in the speech. This was not going to be a little England phenomenon. This was going to be Britain having a strategic relationship with the European Union, but then stepping out in the world, and if liberated from the restraints of the customs union, beginning to negotiate a number of free trade agreements with a number of big players around the world, including, of course, India, the GCC and the United States, probably at the top of the queue.
How difficult is this decoupling going to be for Britain? What is it going to mean for Britain's economy? What is it going to mean for trade partners to Britain?
Well, I think it's a huge challenge, Brexit. It's never been attempted before. There's never been a country that has left the European Union. And I think the fact that she said that we don't aim to be part of the single market, though we might want to have access to it in some way, to a degree simplifies the negotiation. To have a clean Brexit makes it easier to look for a free trade agreement, tariff-free barriers between the United Kingdom and the European Union. A big challenge for the City of London is, of course, that it's clear that passporting will not now be likely. So how comfortable will they be with some process of equivalence in order to be able to maintain their leadership in financial affairs?
We've had big banks say this is going to hurt the financial business that's at the heart of the City of London. Do you expect a big knock to the British economy because of this?
Well, for the moment, the British economy is doing reasonably well in the context. Too early to tell. I think the fact that this negotiation is going to take place over 2 years, and that there will be a transitional period that might extend another 3 years, gives time for negotiators to cushion the blow. I'm sure the UK economy will get some knocks through this process, but the fact that there is now a 12-point plan that looks to a relatively clean Brexit with assurance that we won't be falling off the cliff edge, that there will be some sort of transitional agreement if our European partners agree to it, I think that gives a possibility for some economic stability moving forward.
Okay, speaking of Europe, it's not just Brexit. We have 2 or 3 big elections coming up in Europe through the course of the year. I think there is some degree of fear, at least here in Davos, that some of the results might be, more right-wing than most people expect. That might lead to another wave of populism, this time in Europe and not in America. What are you anticipating?
Well, I think a lot of Europeans are concerned that Brexit and the Trump election represented the rise of populism, the rejection of elites and political leaders who have for 10 or 15 years said we have to listen much more closely to our people, really do have to demonstrate that they're listening now to their people if they want to retain office and retain power. My gut instinct is that in Germany, Chancellor Merkel will succeed again, and that there will be a coalition government. And perhaps in France, the French people will decide that, as often in the past, they will buck the trend, and the most right-wing leader presenting herself for the elections might not be elected. But these are elections to follow with great interest and care, obviously.
In a few days from now, we'll see President-elect Trump become President Trump. His foreign policy approach has confounded many people. How are you reading it? And, what do you make of everything that he said with regards to trade agreements, with regards to his approach to Mexico, with regards to his approach to, close partners like India, but a cut down on H-1B visas. I mean, there are a variety of angles to this. What strikes you as the most important ones to watch in the first year of his presidency?
Well, I think the celebrated phrase is that we have to watch what he does, not what he says, not least because you can always quote Trump against Trump. There are often contradictory statements that come out even from him personally. So I think what is important is to see what things develop in the next 3 to 6 months as his cabinet takes shape. Rex Tillerson clearly very interested in ensuring that there's a strong U.S. foreign policy on the global stage. Jim Mattis at Defense, very interesting because he was, of course, CENTCOM commander, has a very deep and profound understanding of the Middle East. In his confirmation hearings, said that in his judgment, Russia was the primary threat, the primary menace to the United States, very different to what Trump had said in the past. So I think you might find that there will be, in the initial phases, more continuity than differences from the past. But the difficulty will be to see how Trump engages personally as he travels abroad and what kind of personal relations he establishes with leaders. But the one that most people here in Europe are watching is that crucial U.S.-Russia relationship, because in Europe there is real concern about Putin's revanchism, about the kinds of ways he is threatening Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, or at least posturing, and his aim to unravel the European Union and to see NATO as obsolete are ones that Europeans worry Trump will give too much comfort to.
This is a real fear. I was talking to CEO here just 24 hours ago, and he has business in Scandinavian countries, and he said that he noted that they were building up defense budgets because they thought that the Russian annexation of the Crimean Peninsula 2 years ago posed a sort of continuing real threat to Eastern Europe, as you pointed out, and to Europe as well. So what do you make of how much of a threat Putin will be to Europe?
Well, I think it's important to say that it's unlikely that Putin will wish to challenge directly the Article 5 commitments of the NATO treaty and have a conventional attack into the Baltic states or Eastern Europe. I think the bigger concern is the kind of hybrid threat that Putin might pose to European stability and security in the cyber domain, by the introduction of so-called false news, by the organized criminal networks that are operating in Eastern Europe, a kind of instability by stealth is something that I think concerns people a lot. So when NATO meets, they don't just talk about deploying additional troops, as they are doing to the Baltic states or to Poland or to Romania, but also how does NATO deal with this more complex series of hybrid threats, including in the area of cybersecurity, because Russia is a cyber superpower and has been shown is very willing to use that form of activity to destabilize.
That leaves us with the Middle East to talk about, and again, how do you assess the threat of ISIL? It's very difficult for lay people like us to understand how far they've gotten, in their campaign. And your assessment of really what kind of threat they pose to the rest of the world would be an interesting one.
Well, extreme international Islamic terrorism is one of the two or three top global threats, and it's felt in the Middle East, it's felt in Europe, it's also felt in Asia, it's felt in Southeast Asia. The IISS each year, for example, hosts the Shangri-La Dialogue that brings together defense ministers of the Asia Pacific with partners from North America and Europe. And while there is a lot of discussion at the Shangri-La Dialogue on the South China Sea, the number two issue is the concern that ISIL might find a space in ungoverned or less less well-governed territories in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia, in the Philippines, in Indonesia and the like. So ISIL is something that affects the Middle East, but also Europe, North America, Asia, and to a degree the African continent as well. So it's a global phenomenon, and it's a phenomenon that continues to change and to morph. So we have Al-Qaeda, then we have ISIL. If ISIL is perhaps defeated ultimately in Raqqa, who knows if a cousin of ISIL will eventually emerge. And this is the great challenge we have today because of the way in which so-called Islamic State and other radical groups are able to use the internet to radicalize. You no longer need to hold territory in order to hold sway over the minds of vulnerable people who might be inspired to move in a radical direction. And a lot of the threats that we've seen in Europe and the Middle East recently have come from self-radicalized people who move from relatively well integrated in their societies to radical extremists, perhaps in a space of 6 to 8 weeks.
So the alliance against ISIL has not had much headway, according to you, then?
Well, there has been an awful lot of successes in Fallujah, Mosul soon, Raqqa eventually. This is a 68-country coalition, and ISIL is losing territory. ISIL does not have the territory now that it commanded only a year ago. The concern is that now that it's losing territory and it's telling its followers that it's losing its territory, to a degree it loses prestige, because when it had territory it could call itself an Islamic state, but now that it doesn't have territory, it will be using these other elements of cyber criminality and radicalization of the internet to be able to take pot shots that sometimes will have strategic impact in Europe, Middle East and Asia. So it's going to be a permanent feature, I think, of the geopolitical landscape for a number of years still to come.
Okay, so we've discussed, at least some of the key talking points here in Davos when it comes to geopolitics. What have I missed? What else would you put on the list? What would you rank as the top challenges, at least for this year, while many of them will be challenges that will sort of, continue to work for the next 3, 4, 5 years?
I think the big things to watch for is the nature of US-Russia relationships. That will affect European security. It also affects the way in which certain outcomes in the Middle East might pan out. If the US decides to work very closely with Russia on a political solution in Syria, that might have a certain outcome. If it decides to challenge Russia a bit more because of its engagement alongside Iran, that will mean another outcome. So US-Russia relations, number one. US-China relations, number two. We had here in Davos President Xi Jinping demonstrating himself as the championship of a certain form of globalization with Chinese characteristics, perhaps we might style it. But there's uncertainty as to how that US-China relationship will emerge, not only in the trade and economic sphere, but also in the security sphere. Will the Trump administration challenge China a lot more in the South China Sea? And finally and thirdly, this insidious threat of international terrorism, which is one that countries, but also the private sector, have to be engaged in combating, because after all, since so much of this radicalization happens over the internet and in the cyber domain, public-private partnerships to ensure the security of the cyber domain, the fact that they would not be used for terrorist purposes, is, I think, an important challenge. And that cooperation between government and the private sector, given the ongoing debate on the balance between security and privacy, is not one that is yet entirely resolved, and it's one that the private sector and government still have to work on.
Fair enough, John. I know I promised you that was the last question, but my last one really is whether you think Trump will succeed in rolling back any elements of the Iran deal.
The Iran deal was a technical agreement in order to forestall the possibility of Iran having a nuclear weapon for 10 to 15 years. And that was an international agreement. The United States was part of it, but it also involved the European Union, it involved the UK, France, Germany, Russia, China, and it was then wrapped up by the United Nations Security Council. So I think there'll be a lot of pressure on President Trump to let this agreement run its course. Iran is abiding by its terms. The other signatories are abiding by its terms. It is giving us space on the nuclear proliferation front, and I think the European Union, Russia and China will not be content with an effort to rip up this agreement. So I hope it'll be stable.
John, thank you so much for those insights. Thank you for speaking to Bloomberg Quinn and for braving the cold.